Hello, everyone. My name is Zach, and this is Science Explosion at Hudson Public Library. I'm very excited for today. We are going to be making cheese. So, there are some simple ingredients that you will need today to get started if you want to follow along. Otherwise, just feel free to watch and learn. All right, so if you're following the recipe just like I am, you'll need a gallon of milk. So, you'll want to make sure you get whole milk. Trust me on this. Even if you normally get skim, whole milk is going to be better for this recipe. So I've just got a whole gallon here. Then you're also going to need some vinegar, and you're going to need some lemon juice. Now you're not going to need these whole things worth of this. You're only going to need a half a cup of lemon juice and 1 1/3 tablespoons of vinegar. So not nearly as much as the milk. The milk is the main thing for this. All right, then you're going to need some containers to put it in, something to heat it up in. Get a large pot because this is a whole gallon. You're going to need a lot, and a surface to heat it on. So if you've got a stove, that'll work. Otherwise, you know that I'm working with a hot plate right here. And then this is going to call for cheesecloth. Now, I don't have cheesecloth, and I'm guessing most of you don't. So I'm improvising with some coffee filters. And I'm just going to double up on the coffee filters here to make sure I've got enough of them. But if you have cheesecloth is going to be the best thing. Otherwise, if you are wanting to use something like cheesecloth, you can also use a cotton or other natural fiber piece of cloth. Now, if you've got an old t-shirt or something like that, that'll work fine as long as it's only made of non-synthetic. So don't use polyester, but if you've got 100% cotton, or if you happen to have a hemp shirt or whatever, that'll work fine. Or wool will work, but I wouldn't do wool because you don't want to get the fibers to come off in there and give it a weird flavor. But you could, but don't use polyester. But I'm just using coffee filters because I'm guessing this is going to be what is easier to come by for a lot of people. But those are going to be your options for where those are. Then you're going to need a little colander like I've got here. All right, so let's get started. And then obviously something to stir with and your things to measure with. All right, so I'm going to turn this on to medium heat. And since I'm working with a hot plate, this doesn't get quite as hot as your stoves at home would. So I'm going to turn it up just a little bit higher. I'm going to go not quite medium high heat, but a little above medium. You don't want to do this on high heat because you don't want it to burn. Trust me on that. So let's get this shaken a little bit and then cracked open. All right, so I'm going to take the lid off here and pour that right inside. And I know that's a lot of milk, but yep, we're doing the whole gallon. That's why I said be sure you've got a large container. And don't worry, if you don't have this much, feel free to have the recipe or do whatever you have. All right, and then I'm using a wooden spoon because I don't want anything to mess up the flavor of this. So I don't want the metal to react to it, and I don't want plastic to get off into that. So you're going to want to stir and make sure this doesn't stick to the bottom at all. All right, so with this large amount, this is going to take a little bit to get up there. All right, so we're going to get that stirred. I also really like this pot. I think it's just fun looking. It looks like a cauldron. All right, so I'm going to put that there. All right, so now we're going to wait on this just a little bit. All right, so step one of this process is that we are heating up right here our milk. And so far, it's just the milk that is going in this. So I want you to use your critical thinking skills and think about, why am I heating the milk up? Why aren't we doing this without heat? All right. So I want you to think, what happens when you heat something up? What do you think? So really think about this. If you want to pause the video, you can. Otherwise, just think, what are some of your ideas of why you heat things up? All right, so when you cook things, it's just nice to eat warm food. Yeah, sure, but there's a lot of other reasons why you would want to cook something. Make sure you're stirring this every once in a while. Once it gets hot, we're going to be wanting to stir it quite a bit more. All right. So, all right, so now we are going to keep getting this stirred on here. So give me just a second here. Sorry about that. I had to go help somebody. All right, so where was I on this? Okay, so make sure you're getting this stirred. All right, so talking about heat. So what happens when you heat something up? So besides just making it warm, there are some other interesting things that happen when you heat up food. So let's skip this milk for a second and think, what happens when you heat up something else? So if you were to toast a piece of toast, then you know that it's going to turn brown. So that's one example of something that can happen when you're heating something up. Or just think of any other types of things. If you have pasta that you're cooking, think about it, how it changes. So when you heat something up, the simple way to talk about that is that it's changing the structure of it. So right now, we are making this milk change in structure a little bit, so it's going to be able to react with the other stuff that we're putting on it. So we are heating this milk up, and what that's actually doing is it's going to be changing not just the physical but also the chemical structure of this milk. So that's the first step on making cheese. So I'll be a little more specific with this. What we're doing here is we're breaking down part of the milk, and it's going to change it so it's getting ready to react. All right, so make sure you get that still stirred in there. You don't want this to stick to the bottom. You definitely don't want this to burn. All right. Okay, so we're getting this heated up. I'm gonna turn up just a little more. All right. Let's see that going on here. Perfect. That is going great so far. All right, so what exactly is cheese? I want you to think about that a little bit too. So cheese, I'm sure you're all familiar with cheese, but have you really thought about what it is? All right, so cheese is going to start out with a base, and normally if you're just talking about regular cheese, you're going to start off with milk. So most of the cheese that we have in the United States is going to be cow's milk cheese, just like what this is going to be. So we're specifically making farmer's cheese here, which is a very simple type of cheese, but it's still a cheese. So you're going to, in the US, most of the time start off with cow's milk and then turn that into cheese, but it doesn't have to be cow's milk. So a lot of other places, the common type of cheese and the dairy that they've got is from things like goats or sheep. I actually really like goat cheese. It comes out a little bit differently. So milk comes from mammals. So every type of mammal can produce milk. Now, not every type of milk, though, can be made into cheese. So there's a couple things that make something be able to turn into a cheese, that milk, and the big one is protein. So it has to have enough protein. So protein is really the building blocks of what makes milk turn into cheese. And some mammals produce milk that doesn't have enough protein in it to be able to turn into cheese. I will let you look that up if you're interested in the types of ones that can't, but basically anything that you hear something cheese pretty much can be turned into a cheese because we have turned that into a cheese. So cows, goats, sheep, all of those are the really common ones. But protein is the building blocks of that. And I'll talk a little bit about what proteins really are and what they do. But first, you might have heard that there's other kinds of cheeses as well. All right, so that is definitely going to be the case. So you might have seen things like almond cheese or cashew cheese, or I'm actually not sure if you can make oat cheese. I believe that's one, but I haven't had it. I actually really like cashew cheese. I had a cashew queso that I thought was really good recently. But anyway, so you can make cheeses out of things that aren't technically milk. So you'll still see them as like oat milk is the one that is, I'd say, still really popular right now, but you can get almond milk, cashew milk, soy milk, hemp milk, all sorts of plants can also make something into milk. And then if you process that in a similar but not the same process, then you can also make those into cheeses as well. Now, that's not what we're going to be making today, but just keep those in mind because those are going to be a very similar process. Not quite the same, but pretty similar. All right, so now those cheeses that I just talked about, the ones that come from plants, those are going to be vegan cheeses. But this one is not, because I made this with milk. This is not going to be a vegan thing, obviously, because milk, but I will tell you that the one we're making today, unlike what you usually get from a lot of other places, is going to be a vegetarian cheese. So I'm going to define these terms because you might not know them, especially in Iowa, I would say. So a vegetarian is somebody who doesn't eat animals. So you're not going to eat meat. And usually they won't have fish either. So somebody who has fish but not meat is going to be a pescatarian, but we're just going to ignore that for now and just go with simple vegetarian. But a vegan doesn't eat any meat and doesn't eat any animal products. So you're not going to have milk, you're not going to have eggs, and it really depends on who you're talking to, whether you're going to have things like honey or even really complicated ones like figs. And that is a really interesting story, the whole argument over whether figs are vegan or not. And it's a weird one if you ever want to look that up. All right, but this one is going to be a vegetarian cheese, even though it's not vegan. So this is made with an animal product, but not with the animal itself. Now, most cheeses, and I shouldn't say most because some factories do it a little bit differently, but a lot of cheeses are actually not going to be vegetarian. And I don't think that a lot of people realize that, even some vegetarians, because I've got this here and this here, and these are the things we're adding into it. All right. So if you've watched my programs before, you will know one of my favorite things to do is to tell you about the things that you didn't realize you were eating. So these are the things I'm going to be using to make my solution here react and become cheese. But do you know what the normal one is? All right. So while you're thinking about that, I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story. So I want you to travel back in time with me to the original cheese. All right, so we've had milk for quite a while, but milk is something that spoils rather quickly. So back in the past, we didn't have refrigeration like we do now. And so people needed a way to process this dairy to make it last longer. So they needed clever ways to process it. And it might actually surprise people to know that originally the big idea wasn't to turn it into cheese or into the other types of milk products that we have now. A lot of people, especially I'd say on the European steppes, like the horse nomads, horse, that's another one you can get milk from. I don't think a lot of people realize that either. What they would do is actually ferment it. So if you know, so fermenting is basically teeny tiny little microorganisms that are reacting in it. So that can be things like sauerkraut is a fermented food, or you can have things like, now I know I'm talking to a lot of kids here, so you shouldn't be having these, and honestly, they're not really good for you as adults either, but alcohol is another fermented thing. But there's a lot of other ones. I'd say kimchi is probably my favorite one, but there's lots of others. And if you have not had kimchi, oh man, it's worth a try. It is so good. All right, so fermentation used to be the big way to go with dairy products to make them last longer. But what about cheese? So it might also surprise you to know that somebody didn't just purposefully invent cheese. It happened to be an accident. So imagine that you are riding through the desert and you've got a skin flask full of, so that's the way they would have carried things, full of milk. And you're going along the desert, you're riding along, and when you get some distance into that, you open up your flask and you expect to take a drink of your milk. But what do you know? It's turned solid. Well, today we would know that's cheese. And I'm always impressed by this person who had a thing of milk, noticed that it turned into a solid, and decided it smelled good enough that they still wanted to eat it, because quite an interesting thing to do, I think. But it turned into a solid, and so the first cheese was an accident. Now you might be thinking to yourself, well, wait, why did it just turn solid? We're going through this whole process of doing this. So bear with me here. So they were riding through the hot desert. That's the heat. We're working on the first part of that. And we're going to be getting into the second part coming up here as well. All right, so they were, there was the heat from the desert sun baking onto the bag, but then the other important thing is the fact that they didn't have like a glass container, or the other big thing they would have used back then is gourds to keep liquids in, or jars, things like that, but they happen to be having it in a skin flask. So I know that this might seem a little bit gross to some people now, but a big way that people used to carry things was they would take the intestines of an animal and they would tie it off and then keep liquids in there. And you might not know, but your body, your organs are very waterproof, at least some of them, and they're good at storing things inside of them, which is really good, because if the things that were inside your organs got outside of your organs, there would be a bad time for you, trust me on that one. So it's actually really important that it was in that skin flask. So I'm going to call it that. You can call it a skin flask. You can call it an organ sac thing, but that's what it was carrying it in. And it's so important that it was in there, because besides the heat, you need something else to react to this. And that is going to be your acids. All right, so if you watched the last video, you know I talked about acids and bases a little bit, and you will know that vinegar is a fairly weak acid. Lemon juice is also an acid. And so both of these are going to react to the proteins. Remember, I said I'd bring it back to that, in the milk, and those are going to transform this milk a little bit more. Make sure you get this still stirring. Still just smells like milk. All right, really scrape the bottom if you're following along with me. You don't want this to burn. Trust me, that could ruin your whole batch. Okay, so these are the acids that we're using to get it to react in this, but the original ones would not have been, say, the lemons or anything that we'd be using here. So they would have been using the contents itself of that stomach lining, so, or intestines, whatever they're, I think it was the stomach. Yeah, it was the stomach. And so that is because there is also some chemicals inside of stomach acid that will react and to make cheese too. And that, for the longest time, is really the way of how cheese was made. Now today, a lot of times they will just add industrial chemicals and things like that, but a lot of homemade cheese, you are still going to go to the store and buy that stuff. And so, yeah, that is a lot of cheese that you are going to be having is going to be made with the contents of an animal's stomach. So you are welcome for one more interesting thing that you get to learn about what your food actually is. But this one, we are making it a more vegetarian option. If you do happen to have that stuff, then go feel free to try making that as well. If you just so happen to be a hunter, you could even try seeing if it would work using maybe a deer stomach if you would happen to have that. All right, so I'm going to make sure I keep this going. If you're making a smaller batch, then this will definitely be done sooner. And our goal here is to just barely bring this to a boil. Because when it does, then we are going to be adding our other ingredients. Okay, so I know you know the heat. We've been working on that a long time, and I told you that we need the acids to interact with this, and they are interacting with the protein here. So when I add these into here, definitely don't just dump them like that, but when I add the acids, they're going to bind to a protein, to the proteins inside of what is still now just milk. So when they do that, the proteins are going to change their shape and they're going to interlock together. All right, so what is protein? All right, so proteins, think of them sort of like little building blocks. So you have like bricks or Legos, however you want to think about this, it's going to help you to think of them. They are the things that really give things structure, and they are everywhere inside of living things. So a big part of you is made of protein. So I feel like there's a little bit of confusion with the word protein. So I'm going to talk about this way, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about what people talk about protein as being. But protein are little building blocks. They're made up of something called amino acids. And so those are going to basically be these structures that help to link together, and they build structures within you. So your skin is made of protein, your fingernails, your hair, it's all made of protein. And so protein is actually really important to make you stay, or to build these structures within your body. It's a necessary nutrient. All right, so I think there's definitely some confusion when people talk about protein because they talk about getting protein in your diet. And that is really important. But I think what needs to be said is when we're talking about proteins, we're really talking about the building or the things that proteins are made up of. So if you imagine a Lego as like just a little Lego brick, I should have just grabbed one. But if you imagine a Lego brick, that's a protein. But then the little studs on top of that, those are the amino acids. And so it's important to get those amino acids which build up that block of protein. And so those are necessary for building the structures inside of your body. And the reason I say that is because what's really important is not just getting those proteins, but getting those amino acids that can build those proteins. All right, so all right, that's going to be just a little bit longer here. All right, so make sure you're still watching that. Don't let it burn. I know I've said that a few times, but it's really important. Do not let that burn. All right, so I can see it steaming up, so I think I'm getting a little bit closer on there. All right, so proteins are these building blocks, and so you need complete proteins to be able to function. So where can you get complete proteins? So I think that's actually a really interesting question. There are different routes that you can go to get a complete protein. So if I were to eat a piece of meat, then because that is the protein that's in the building blocks of that animal already, you can get a complete protein from that. But you can also get a complete protein from vegetable sources. And this is what vegetarians and vegans are going to do. So if anybody tells you you can't get nutrients by being a vegetarian or vegan, they're just not right. But anyway, so it's interesting because different plants and the different parts of the plants actually have different amino acids to build those proteins. So if you wanted to say get a complete protein out of one meal, then you can get it from, say, a grain and then something like a seed or a legume, which is interesting because also grains are a seed. If you didn't know that, I'll get to that in a second. So like a piece of bread with peanut butter or rice and beans. So something grain, something bean is a good way to get that complete one. So by the way, here's a bonus thing that you probably didn't know what you were eating. Do you know what grains are? All right, so I actually still have a piece of pasta from one of the other science experiments that I did. So this little piece of pasta is going to be made from wheat. There are lots of other types of grains, but they all have one thing in common. And that one thing, is that they're grass. So a lot of people don't know this for some reason, but pretty much all of the grains that you are going to be consuming are a type of grass. And we just take the seeds and then grind them up. So that's going to be true whether you're talking about wheat, whether you're going to be talking about barley, whether you're going to be talking about oats, or whether you're going to be talking about our Iowa favorite, corn. Yes, corn itself is just a grass that has been selectively bred for a very long time to give incredibly large kernels. But yes, these are all just grasses that are, we gather the seeds and grind them up. And if you are wondering, yes, that is, you could do the same thing with other types of grasses. So if you were to let the grass, if you happen to have a lawn, if you let that grow out and let the seeds grow on that, wait for them to ripen and then grind them up, you could 100% make them into bread. In fact, I have done that before, and trust me, it's pretty much just bread. All right, so this is taking a little bit longer to heat up than I figured it would, but that is okay. We just need to make sure that we are stirring it. That's going to stop it from sticking to the bottom, and also make sure that the heat is a little more even. Let's see, how warm is that? Decently warm. All right. But not quite boiling. We just need to get it to barely boiling, and then then we'll be ready for the next step of this process. All right, so talking about proteins. So I feel like you've got a little bit of a better idea of what proteins are. They are the building blocks of things. And the reason that they work so well as these building blocks is because they can form these structures. And these structures are going to link together. So that's what we're doing right now. The heat is going to break down these proteins. And then when we attach these acids, they're going to send their little molecules in here and link together, and they're going to form strong chains. And that's going to basically turn this from being a liquid into a solid eventually when this finishes heating up, which is taking a little bit longer than I thought it would, but that's okay. We work with what we have. Okay, I can start to hear it now, so I think we must be getting close. By the way, something I just learned recently that I thought was very interesting. So Americans actually have much more milk than people from the rest of the world. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But because we have so much more milk and so many more dairy products, including cheese, than the rest of the world, we actually smell different to the rest of the world. So to a lot of people throughout the world, people from the United States smell like, what do you think? All right, so you might not have guessed it, but we smell like baby spit up to a lot of the rest of the world. So that is what a lot of the world thinks we smell like. And it is somewhat justified actually, because a lot of the rest of the world has so much less dairy than us. And there's a big reason for that too. So in the US, we have quite a bit of milk and dairy products in general, but that's not the case for a lot of the rest of the world, actually most of the rest of the world. So I want you to imagine the places in the world. So have you ever heard of the word lactose? All right, so you might have. So lactose is something that is inside dairy. Now, not all different types of dairy. Some milks don't have lactose, and some, well, a lot of milks have a lot less lactose than is what is found in cow's milk, but especially cow's milk has a lot of lactose in it. And so you might know someone, or you might even be yourself, lactose intolerant. So being lactose intolerant basically means that you can't process lactose, and it can make you feel sick. So lactose is, there's a bunch of lactose in this milk. Even still right now, if I were to hand this in a glass to somebody who's lactose intolerant, it would give them indigestion. All right. So what it is it's this sugary compound. It actually has a little bit of a sweet taste, and it needs to be broken down in your body. I believe it's lactase is the thing that breaks it down. You might want to check me on that though, but it will break it down inside of your body. Now, there's a couple things that you can do if you are lactose intolerant. So you can turn it into a different type of product. So actually, this cheese that we are going to be making, even though the milk has lactose in it, if we were to make this cheese and then let it age, it's going to have virtually none to very little lactose in it. Now, if we're going to eat this cheese fresh, which is probably what we're going to be doing, then it's still going to have a decent amount of lactose in it. But most of the cheeses that you get at the store that are aged, like cheddar, is actually not going to have very much lactose in it. All right, but I want you to consider this. So we think of being able to have lactose as the normal and lactose intolerance as being the thing that's unusual, but that's actually not true. So we should really think about it as being the default of not being able to have lactose versus some people can have lactose. So the reason for that is only a small percent of the world actually can have lactose. And those are Northern Europeans most Western Europeans and Northern Africans, especially groups like the Maasai. So the reason for that is because those are the groups who have the cattle history. They have a history of being able raising cattle, and so it seems that they've developed an immunity to that and an ability to process that. Whereas the rest of the world, so the vast majority of the rest of Africa, Eastern Europe and Asia, and then the Americas do not have the ability to process lactose. And that's because they did not raise cattle and did not have the need to have that, so they never developed it. So being able to drink milk as an adult is actually more unusual. So I say as an adult because milk, well, we're mammals, that is the standard thing to have when you're a baby, which is why, again, people in a lot of other parts of the world say that Americans smell like baby spit up. Just so you know, I think that's a good thing to know. I would want to know that that's what other people think. All right, and so when I say Northern Africans and Western Europeans, that includes their descendants too. So I myself am descended mostly from Western Europeans. And so I am not lactose intolerant. I have the ability to process lactose. Now, you're still going to have people who are mostly descendant from one of these two groups and still not have the ability to process lactose. That's pretty common. And so you might know somebody who, say, has British ancestors and they still are lactose intolerant. That's still normal. But I think it's important to know that the vast majority of people, most of the people around the world, cannot process milk, which is why I think it's kind of silly that we have in the USDA recommendations for the My Plate, you've got the plate with a glass of milk on the side. For the vast majority of the people of the world, that's not a realistic meal to have at all. So there's my take. Sorry, USDA, but you've changed your thing twice from two different pyramids, and now it's this one, so they'll probably change it again. I think it would have made more sense if it was a glass of water next to the plate. And I know there's other people that have agreed with me on that. And actually, it was somebody else who pointed that one out to me, and I started to realize that, that's a really good point. Okay, we're getting close here. We're getting close. I'm going to run out of things to talk about. Ah, never mind. You know that's not true. I always have more science things to talk about. All right, so where was I? So yes, I think it's actually very important to know that the vast majority of the world cannot process lactose. Now that's milk, but milk products like cheese are still something to have. But it's also important to know that that is not a necessity for a diet. So if you take a look at somewhere like, well, let's say Japan. Japan has not had milk as part of their diet, as a traditional diet, for the most part. And so they get nutrients from other sources. They definitely have a seafood-heavy diet, probably one of the most seafood-heavy diets in the world. But they don't have that. And this is going to be a similar case in most of Asia, in North and South America, and in most of Africa. They're just not going to be having a lot of dairy products in general. So they also, they're not having milk, but they're also not having things like cheese. There's actually been a big marketing push lately, and by lately I mean like the last 10, 15 years, to try to get cheese to be a more popular thing in Japan, and it's not really taking off. Which is funny because some other things really have taken off, like fried chicken is super popular in Japan, especially in Christmas time, which is a whole other story onto itself. All right, we're getting there. This is almost there. So the majority of Americans, by the way, are descendant from one of those two groups, and especially the Western Europeans. So most Americans do have the ability to process lactose, but it's actually not a good idea for people who are lactose intolerant to have milk past being a child. So as mammals, then you might already know, that is what we have when we are babies, is that dairy. But as an adult, it actually can cause you a lot of digestive issues if you try to have that when your body can't handle it. So it's actually a specific adaptation to those groups of people. And it's important to not say that other groups of people who don't have that should be having milk. So I think that's actually a very big misunderstanding. So, but it's also important to know, if you are not lactose intolerant, if you have the ability to process lactose, then there's no reason for you to stop drinking milk because other people can't process milk. It just means you don't need to tell them that they need to have it. So I think that's a big misconception. And if you are lactose intolerant, then there is absolutely nothing wrong with that, and you're actually in the majority. All right, we're almost there. All right, so I'm just going to check my list here to make sure I've got everything ready. All right. We're almost there. And as soon as this comes to a boil, we're going to turn off the heat. All right, so we're making farmer's cheese here, and that's the probably simplest type of cheese. The second I'd say is mozzarella. So if you're wanting one that's a step up from that, that's a good one to go to. Then when you get into more advanced ones, you're going to start getting into more advanced techniques with aging, with adding other things. And if you do want to learn those, then we've got a book at the library here that I think is really good. That is called Cheese Making Self-Sufficiency, and that is by Rita Ash. And I would say that that is definitely a good one to take a look at if you're wanting to try some more advanced cheeses. Alrighty. All right, I think we're just about there. So I'm going to make sure I've got this ready to go. All right, so you're going to need to take, hold on just a second here. Okay, great. Sorry, just had to check on something for a second. All right, so all right, that's almost ready, so I'm going to get my other stuff ready here. All right, so remember we need a whole half of a cup of lemon juice. So I'm just using this from a bottle, but you can definitely feel free to squeeze from fresh lemons if you've got them. Some recipes you can find will actually call for just so much of a lemon, but I actually think it's better to use the measurements for this because different types of year, you're going to get different acidity on the lemons and different sizes of lemons. So for this, you want to be fairly exact. All right, so I've got that ready. And then for the vinegar, you're going to need 1 1/3 tablespoons. So I'm just going to get that ready and put into another container here. So I've got that ready to go. All right, so we've got and I'm just going to eyeball it to give it about 1/3 because I've got a 1 here. Ooh, a little more than that. So that's 1 1/3, just about. All right, so I've got those ready to go for when I take this off the heat. All right, so I think that's good. I think that's just barely gotten to a boil here. So I'm going to turn off the heat, and then I'm going to add these. So remember, that's 1/2 cup of lemon juice. And that is 1 1/3 tablespoons, not teaspoons, of white vinegar. And then you're going to want to stir that together. All right, make sure you get that stirred. And then you're going to leave that for just a couple minutes. That should take around 5 minutes, I'd say should be good with that. All right, and so I'm going to pause my video so that you're not just watching that happen, and I'll be back in just a few. Okay, great. Welcome back, everyone. So I guess you might have just been watching this whole time, but I ran out and cleaned some things up while this was resting. All right, so now you can see I've got some beautiful chunks right here. So if you are following along with me, what you'll notice is that it's mostly liquid, and then there are chunks in here. So these chunks are going to be the curds. So if you ever get the cheese curds, say at Hanson's, which are great, by the way, then that's what those are. But the liquidy part is the whey. And so what we're going to do is separate those. So I actually got this to ladle them out with. And line this here with one of this, and there we go. We'll get that on there. And then you're just going to scoop some in. And you want this over a bowl so that you can get the liquid out. And I say over a bowl instead of a sink because you do not want to throw away the whey. It is actually something really good to keep. I don't think a lot of people realize that. So you can see it's dripping out on there. And then you can use your ladle to push it down, or you can grab the sides of your cloth. But you'll want to try to get as much of that liquid out as you can. Don't force too much of it out, though, because you're still not going to want to dry out your curds too much. But Make sure you're pushing that out, and your whey is going to collect in there. And then, now that you've got that, so you can also just grab your cloth, and it's going to be warm, so be careful, but squeeze, get that liquid out. So because it's warm, I'm actually just going to use this. I think that's actually working pretty well. And then I've got a plate right here. So I would recommend putting it on a plate. I think will work well. So let's get that there. So I'm just getting a little bit out to show you, but you can put it on a plate, and then I'm also going to stack another plate on top of this, and then you'll want to put something heavy on top of that. So I'm not going to put the library books on top of this because I'd be worried about it bleeding through, but whatever you have that can put some weight on it. So that's going to force some more of the moisture out and keep it solid. Now, not quite as solid as something like cheddar, which, by the way, is named after the process of making it, cheddaring, which is the stacking of the cheese, but it's still going to make it a lot more solid. And then all you're going to have to do is let that sit. So you're going to want to leave that overnight, and then that is going to be some delicious cheese for you. Now, you could just eat these curds right now, and they will be pretty good. In fact, I'm going to try one. Actually, I'll get it from this, so I'm not spilling too much whey. But you can also add some salt for flavoring of this, and that'll definitely help. But yep, that is cheese. So we did it. All right, so congratulations, everyone. We have made our own cheese. So I think that is a great accomplishment. So thank you, everyone, so much for joining me. So this has been Science Explosion at Hudson Public Library, and my name is Zach. So I hope you join me again next time. Thanks. Bye.